Hello, Nella. How are you?
Hi, I am doing well. How about you?
Good, good. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do, which is, as you know, the Facebook Live series that we do with Marsy's Law for All every couple of weeks. We tried to do it last week, but there were some technical glitches, which happens to be part of the Zoom life that we all live these days. So thanks for being patient and agreeing to do it again this week.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. Great to be here.
Well, I just wanted to. We all know you are an incredible advocate for victims' rights, and your story spans many different countries and states and cities. And we should probably get right into it because you know all about Marsy's Law because you actually work for Marsy's Law now. And Marsy's Law, as you know, was started because of an inspirational story. Marsy Nicholas was stalked and murdered by her ex-boyfriend in 1993. And it was right after her funeral when her brother, Dr. Nicholas, and her mom were at a grocery store and they were confronted by his sister's murderer. And they had no idea how that person could have been out on bail without any kind of notification whatsoever. And Dr. Nicholas at that point decided to dedicate a large part of his life to doing everything he could to protect victims' rights and give victims meaningful and enforceable constitutional rights, which he has done by creating Marsy's Law. And through the creation of Marsy's Law, where we have put victims' rights on the ballot and ultimately successfully passed constitutional amendments ensuring victims' rights in many states across the country, we've seen amazing inspirational stories like yourself, who have gotten into the victims' rights space because of the life they've lived and the experiences they've had. So I want to start with your story where you were born and raised. If you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for taking it that far back. I am from Belgrade, Serbia. That's in Europe, and so I was born and raised there. Actually, I was born to Croatian father and Serbian mother, which turned out to be a pretty interesting situation to be in during the war that happened in Yugoslavia in 1990s. Actually, there was a time when I remember I was actually going to visit. I don't think I told you this, but I was actually going to visit my aunt who used to live in Boston at the time. And for that, I obviously needed my passport. And I went to the office just to ask for the papers I needed in Serbia, in Belgrade. And as I was asking for my papers, they asked me what nationality I was. And at the time, I was still like, I don't know the difference between nationality and citizenship. Like I thought I was the child of the world, you know. And I looked at them and I'm like, what do you mean? I need Belgrade citizenship. And they looked at me and they said, I'm sorry, you're Croatian. We can't help you. And so I ended up actually with no papers or ability to travel for a few years. I had to apply for Serbian nationality. And I think that was the beginning of my journey to seeking where my home is. And I think it finally came to full circle once I moved to United States of America.
Yeah, it almost seems like the United States found you as much as you found the United States. And you know, you and I have talked a lot about your journey and your story, not just geographically, but the rest of your story is really a story about liberation and freedom and the way you have worked to liberate yourself in so many different ways. And starting, like you said, where it seemed like neither Serbia nor Croatia wanted you as a citizen. And it then took you from Serbia, Croatia, you moved to the Middle East, to Egypt and Kuwait. And at some point you got married.
That's right. Well, teenagers all over the world, I think, have a common thing that they think they know everything. Please argue with me if you think differently. But I was certainly that kind of teenager. And so I was about 19 years old when I fell in love with a man that later became my husband, and I married him, and that took me then to move all the way to Egypt, and then later Kuwait.
And at some point, your marriage became very volatile and rocky. And could you
Right.
tell us a little bit about how that started and how it manifested itself?
Yeah, well, looking back, of course, there were many red flags that I unfortunately did not see at the time, due to my, naivete, or just for the lack of tools that I had in my box in terms of the wisdom that I had at the time. So he actually did not become physically abusive until a few years later, into our marriage, and actually after my first son was born. And then, at least it felt at the time, it came out of nowhere, and I found myself in a country where I had nowhere to go. And I know that's a very, or maybe a foreign concept to us living here in United States, luckily so. But in many countries around the world, there women like me have nowhere to turn to. And so I couldn't call the police because the culture is such that these things are still seen as kind of the family thing. And so if you speak out, you're betraying, you're being disloyal to your family. So I couldn't call the police. I did go to my embassy, actually, but they couldn't help me either because I did have a child at the time, and that complicates things. And so I was left alone. I felt very alone. And it took me years until I was able to finally leave that situation.
Yeah, I remember it was really moving when you and I were talking about this, and you said you felt invisible in the world with no place to turn for help at that time. And I think it's important that you gave us that context, as far as gaining an appreciation for the culture that you were actually living in, and you weren't in the United States, which makes you really appreciative of the different services that people can avail themselves of. And we'll get to that now in the United States, and part of why you became involved in the victims' rights movement. And at some point, so you now have 3 boys, right?
Yes, 3 beautiful boys. Yes.
And so, as do I. That's one of the things that you and I share. We both have 3 sons, and mine.
Some things are the same all over the world. You have 3 boys. Your life experience is the same, no matter where you are in the world.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And in fact, my middle son, it's his birthday today too, so I can give
Happy birthday.
Yeah. So at some point when you only had your first son, and things became pretty turbulent with you and your husband, you described to me an incident one night where he basically forced you to go back to Serbia.
Yes. And it's kind of really hard for me when I look back and when I recount my life that was at the time. I kind of talk about myself as I was some kind of an object, like he took me here and he took me there. And the sad reality is that was my life. I wasn't allowed to leave the house on my own. There was always someone there. I wasn't allowed to drive to work. My friends were chosen for me. So it's kind of like I really had basic human freedoms were taken away from me. And so when it came to this night, that is hard for me to recall, because no matter how difficult the physical abuse gets, I think what hurts even more are those times when I know, for example, if he would spit on me in passing, and I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. And so when it came to my son, he just one night decided, or he decided days before, I don't know. But what I saw happen that night was that he just came to me with my bag and said, you're going back home. And you can imagine my son sleeping in the other room. I was actually still breastfeeding him, because actually the times when I breastfed him were actually the only times when I felt that I had some kind of control over my own child, because even the way he was raised, I struggled to have, or fought to be able to have input in that as well. And he just took me to the airport in the middle of the night, and I couldn't even say goodbye. Not that I ever wanted to, but I couldn't even tell my son anything. And he was left in the room sleeping, and I was taken to the airport by my ex-husband and his father, and I was put on the plane. Again, just like an object, because I had no say in anything. And I then found myself back in Serbia. And of course, I did have an opportunity to stay and never come back. But I couldn't, because my son was back there, and he didn't ask anybody to be brought into this world. And I saw it obviously as my responsibility to be there for him, no matter what the cost. And actually, it was made very clearly to me that if I decide to go back, that I should forget about arguing about anything, meaning, up until that point, I was still trying to fight for, my right to work, or my right to do this or that. But it was very made clear that I won't be able to do any of these things. So I actually went back, not thinking, not having this romanticized view of, him changing for the better at all. I knew I was going back. I knew what my life will be looking like for foreseeable future. But I went back so that I can be with my son. And it actually got worse. Probably doesn't come as a surprise. But then I just knew, okay, so this is my life. I have to live like this for however long, until I am able to actually figure out the way out. And it took years until I was able to do that, but I never stopped planning.
And you said that despite being in this fear of your husband at the time, you talked to me a little bit about that there was just a way that he even looked at you that scared you, because you knew what he was capable of.
Yeah, and I think, of course, I'm speaking from my own experience, and I appreciate that, as as much as different experiences of different, of all of us can overlap, they're also unique in their own way. So I'm speaking for myself when I say that, again, we're going back to what is the purpose of the abuse. Abuse is very purposefully there as piece of a puzzle in the whole scheme of being able to control another human being. And so, if he knows that he can scare me so much that only that look, or the way he grinds his teeth when he looks at me, if that will do the job, he may not need to take it any further at that moment. And that's an awful way to live. That's an awful way to live.
Oh, it certainly is. And you described the story one time that he would not even allow you to wear lipstick.
Oh, yes.
You would even look down at the ground when you walked, because you just did not even want to look at him.
Well, story of my red lipstick. I don't know why, but I see it as my symbol of my personal liberation, because and I wear it with pride. Because I wasn't allowed to do that, it would frustrate him. He would get upset. And actually, later, when we were already in United States, there was one time when I did put the lipstick on, and he got so upset, and we were in the car, and he threatened to change the way I look unless I take the lipstick off. And our kids were actually in the car, and they saw all that, and he started doing his thing with his teeth, and he clenched his fist. And but that was already a little bit into us being in United States already. And the reason why I remember that particular moment maybe more vividly than some others is because that was the first time that I remember I looked at him and I said no. And that is one of the biggest gifts that this country has given me. It's the right to say no. And yeah, so that's the story of my red lipstick.
Well, when you talk about the United States and the freedom that the United States affords to our citizens, you endured to see if we can get to the United States and your journey here. You endured about 10 years from 2003 to 2013 of physical abuse, emotional abuse at the hands of your now ex-husband, which we could talk about for hours. But in an effort to bring this story and your journey to the United States, in 2011, something happened in Egypt that finally put your plan into an accelerated place where you could actually get to the United States. Could you tell us briefly about what that was in 2011 and then your journey to the United States?
Yes. In 2011, Egyptian government was overthrown, and there was the wave of people fleeing from the country due to that unrest. And I personally saw that as an opportunity to advocate behind the scenes to get my family, my children, and my ex-husband all the way to United States in order for me to actually be able to leave him and have my children with me. So it took me about 2 years, of talking to him about coming here. Some reasons were very obvious. Others, I had to kind of work on that to get him to come here. And sometimes I would even have to tell him, like, maybe we shouldn't move to United States. And, because in the end, it really had to be his decision. And so that brings us to 2013. We came here to New York, of all places. And I love New York. And we came on tourist visa. And we landed there. We stayed there for about 2 weeks. But there is my favorite moment that I always recount, just because it was life-changing for me. And that was the time when, so obviously, as I've seen American movies before. So yes, I've seen the Statue of Liberty before in my life. And actually, I know this is your favorite thing, but I did learn my English by watching the Full House. There, I said it. And
so Uncle Jesse from Full House taught you your English.
That was a secret, Peter. My secret crush. I had the biggest crush on Uncle Jesse. But anyway, now that we know that, so we were in New York, and we were on this ferry boat, and we were going to towards the Staten Island, and it was kind of scenic because the day was kind of misty. You know how it gets sometimes over there. And as we were approaching towards the Statue of Liberty, I remember the mist kind of dissipated. And then all of a sudden, there it was, the Statue of Liberty in front of me. And I remember looking at it. I will never forget that. And I just started crying because that was the first time in how many years, decades, that I felt actually like I was free. And that moment of that basic feeling, that most basic organic freedom that so many around this world are denied and can never experience, that's something that I hold so dear to my heart, and I one of the reasons why I will always be so grateful to this country that gave me that.
It's very powerful because you talked about your planning and all the time that you were in the Middle East, and you kept planning and planning, and then that trip to the United States, both literally and figuratively, your freedom became clearer and clearer, and then that international symbol of freedom, the Statue of Liberty, became clearer gradually, and then ultimately, as you began to start to experience your own personal freedom, that symbol of freedom became clear right in front of your eyes. It's really powerful the way that you describe that.
And you know what? That's exactly what it is. Because even in that moment, I did not have all the answers. I did not know yet how I was going to leave him, right? It took me about a year and a half to leave him after that. But I knew that I could. I knew that I could. And that's what matters.
And then when you were empowered and you empowered yourself at that point and you knew that you could, that's when you put your plan even more into place, and you moved from New York to Fairfax, Virginia, and then to North Carolina, and then ultimately to where you are today in Madison, Wisconsin. And if you could just tell us really quickly about your ride from Virginia to North Carolina, and then ultimately you talked about when you finally left, you call it your freedom ride from North Carolina to
Sure
where
you
you
want
are
to talk
today
about that? Are you
in
sure?
Wisconsin.
Because I always say I do not know how in the world did I get the driver's license. I don't know, because I literally had, they maybe they thought I would, I don't know, I wasn't a teenager, they assumed I drove. Anyway, I got it with just like 3 hours of instruction. I was danger on the road, I mean literally. And here I was, I had to kind of leave very quickly, and I put my children in the car, and I knew that I needed to get to Wisconsin. Basically, first time for me on highway. I mean, I was scared to even change the how do you call them, the
Oh,
lane,
change your
right?
lanes.
Yeah, and I mean, I literally remember like, oh my god, oh my god, oh my god, I'm doing it and changing the lane. But I do call it my freedom drive, because with every mile that I was putting behind myself, I knew I was getting that much closer to my personal freedom, right? And that of my children as well. And I always say, people sometimes tell me, oh, how could you do that? Or how did, you know, I always say we don't give ourselves enough credit, because you never know what you're capable of until you actually have to do it. And I think everyone can do it once we are determined enough. And having 3 children in the back of the car, I think is provides for a very good reason to do it. So
Yeah, it's a very powerful image to think of you with your 3 sons all packed up and leaving that life of abuse behind, all of you, on your way to a new life. And thank God you had friends in Wisconsin that gave you a place to go. And then you started your new life, and you started to work in the victims' rights space, and you started to work in the state legislature in Wisconsin for a state senator, and you started with an internship.
yes, well, this is what I also always say. What is American dream? I think for me it is people who are in this country, because without those people I would never have opportunities that I had, and I would never be able to get to where I am today if there were not people who were there along the way to believe in me, right? And that includes the state senator, Jennifer Schilling, that I worked for, and actually after I got that internship, because of course I had all the opportunities to reinvent myself and do whatever I wanted in the world. And so, of course, what am I going to do? Go and work for the state senate. I remember they actually called me after a month of my internship. They called me to this room. It was a big room, felt very intimidating, big table, desk, and they sat me down. And I thought I was getting fired because, like, why would they call me in this room? And they actually offered me a full-time job, which was pretty incredible when you think about the fact that you American people, you build your resume since you're how old? 3 years old, 2 years, I don't know. I had none of that. So I obviously had to have someone believe in me, and that happened. And I was very, very grateful for that opportunity to be part of that. So
And then when you left the state senate, you stayed involved, and you actually met the governor of Wisconsin, Governor Walker at the time, and convinced him that he needed to appoint you to something.
Well, he was absolutely wonderful because I actually, we were at this conference and I kind of sneaked past the security and I went and I tapped him on his shoulder and I said, "Hello, I'm new in this country and I would just love to, get to know you better. Can we have a conversation?" And he said yes, and then we met at the at the state capitol. I'm sorry, and we talked, and I told him that I learned about this governor's council on domestic violence and on domestic abuse, and I told him I think you should appoint me to this council because I know I would do a great job at it. And he said, "Done, great, awesome." And so he also believed in me, and I will forever be grateful for that. And yeah, I that's in addition to other work that I've been doing over the years, just because that is my way. As I actually now feel I can speak for many others who are part of this work. It's our way of giving back, because when you go through hardship, in order to make some sense of it, giving back and hoping that it will help another person, it's our way of making through it, and having the hope for a better future.
Which brings us full circle back to Marsy's Law, because when you became stayed involved in the victims' rights space in Wisconsin, you became aware of a friend of yours that you used to work with in the state legislature named Miranda. Yes. Alerted you to the fact that there was a victims' rights movement and a victims' rights organization that was coming to Wisconsin to pass a constitutional amendment that would ensure that victims' rights were meaningful and enforceable in the state of Wisconsin by getting on the ballot and passing on the ballot. And you then became full-time involved with Marsy's Law.
Yes, and how lucky am I? And actually, the Wisconsin team was already full force on doing amazing work here in Wisconsin. And I love my team. I work with the best team. And I think people that I work with, such as Miranda and Margot, are a great testament to how incredibly amazing Marsy's Law for All, or as organization really is, because each and every day they not only work so hard to ensure that victims in our state and then around the country are seen, right? But also that people like me have the opportunity to become part of this movement in a meaningful way. And again, I am so grateful to be part of that.
Yes, and Marsy's Law is so blessed to have you on the team, because you can speak to survivors and victims in a way that most can't, because of your shared experiences, and that we have seen many times in many different states. is something that is so moving, when a survivor, like you said, so many times can feel invisible, like you did, with nowhere to turn and no one that can relate to them. And so when you talk about Marsy's Law and what Marsy's Law does, it comes in a little bit more of a unique, special presentation when someone like you can talk about it.
Well, I thank you for saying that, and you're right. It really comes down to telling victims and survivors you are seen, right? And that's life changing. That turns them from being passive part of the system to actually being able to say no, just like I did years ago with that lipstick. And that's a gift that this movement gives to each and every victim and survivor and their families. And I cannot tell you how privileged I feel that I am just for being able to contribute to that, even in a small way.
Well, thanks to your work, as we know, Marsy's Law was passed in Wisconsin, and you continue to do your best to raise awareness and to work with stakeholders and domestic violence groups and victims' rights groups to help towards the successful implementation of Marsy's Law across the state of Wisconsin. I want to thank you so much for joining us, Nela. Thank you for the great work that you do, and for sharing your story of freedom, the ultimate story of freedom, both literal and figurative, and the way that you described it to us today. And thanks for empowering the victims in a way that you were empowered yourself, and inspiring them every day.
Thank you so very much. Thank you so much. And I look forward to everything that we collectively as a team will continue to do in this country.
Thank you so much, Nela. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Peter.
Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.